welcome. We have a great panel for our Road to Recovery NYC 2025 series that is starting. We've had some panels in the past. These are our continuing discussions, and this panel is this is a blockbuster housing panel with some of the foremost experts in the area of housing. So we are going to, we have 4 panelists. And so the plan, so that attendees are aware, we are going to have the panelists speak for a few minutes each, maybe, 5-6 minutes each. They can talk about the policy proposal that they have posted as part of NYC 2025. There may even be some that go beyond that, given that things have changed even since then. But then that will give us plenty of time for questions and conversations. The attendees might have questions, the panelists might have questions for each other, but attendees also are certainly able to ask questions as well. So we're hoping that this will leave us plenty of time for discussion. So we're going to actually start with our first speaker, Sophie House. She is the Director of Law and Policy at the NYU Furman Center. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Thad. And as Thad mentioned, I'm the Law and Policy Director at the Housing Solutions Lab, which is housed at the NYU Furman Center. And my paper focused on why we should direct policy efforts towards helping current homeowners stay in their homes. So to sort of start from that premise, homeownership provides housing stability, ideally for individuals, and can also at the neighborhood level be a stabilizing force against displacement. When real estate markets are strong, homeownership allows homeowners to build wealth, to benefit from the strength of their investments, and provides protection against rising rents as well. And on the flip side, when we fail to help homeowners stay in their homes, we know that foreclosure is harmful both to individual households and at a larger scale to neighborhoods and communities, that it disrupts those wealth building opportunities, undermines housing stability, leads, at the household level to the loss of a home, and in the aggregate to some of those displacement forces that we're concerned about. But I address this in the paper as well. I think that we run into a few challenges when we think about allowing homeowners working to help homeowners stay in their homes as sort of the focus of our policy attention. There are many ways that American housing policy favors homeownership. So through our zoning regimes, through tax systems, often to the disadvantage of renters who are on average a less wealthy population and then don't have access to those same wealth building and stabilizing mechanisms. And in New York City, especially, which is where we have so many renters, we're in a very good position and we really should think critically about which aspects of American housing, that sort of homeownership focused American housing policy we want to reinforce through local housing policy decisions, and in which aspects we don't. And another challenge that I want to sort of address up front is that if we only focus on preserving homeownership, if we were to make that the center of our New York City housing policy aims today, we would be calcifying a lot of racial disparities and inequality. I think every statistic that I'll probably mention today comes from our 2020 State of the City report, the Furman Center. But in 2019, the homeownership rate for Black households citywide was 26.6%. And for Hispanic households, which is the census designation for that racial group, was 15.9%. That's in contrast to 42.2% for Asian households and 41.2% white households. So we see substantial disparities in homeownership rates, particularly for Black and Hispanic households in New York. So, taking all of that into account, I think we should still care about preserving home ownership and helping homeowners stay in their homes. First, because foreclosure crisis, and this is something we know from the Great Recession, is very likely to disproportionately affect homeowners of color. So at a minimum, we should be concerned about repeating, we should be concerned about, repeating, exacerbating the, harms that we saw play out during that crisis. And, I think we can think about ways to preserve home ownership and provide stability for existing homeowners while expanding access to home ownership. So the challenge, and I think the key, is to think about those preservation efforts as part of, a broader suite of policies, which I'm sure, the other panelists will address to promote equity and opportunity in the housing space. So some of the policy measures, when we think about the preservation side, the two that I want to focus on relate to policies and programs that can help homeowners with their housing costs, and then think about foreclosure prevention measures. So cost burdened homeowners can struggle with the expenses, can struggle with utility payments and with housing pairs, kind of to say nothing of the cost of structural improvements in their homes, especially when we have an aging housing stock. And before the pandemic, so in 2019, about 40% of homeowners in New York City with mortgages were moderately or severely cost burdened, so spending 30% or more of their income on housing costs. And again, that's before the city was in an economic crisis. So while we don't have more recent data, we know that we know how important it is to be addressing those the challenges facing cost burdened homeowners. And there are several city programs that are already in place, and I think could be a focus of policy efforts, either for expansion or thinking about how to target that relief so as to ensure equity and equitable growth. But one is HPD's Home Fix initiative, which is a forgivable loan program for low and moderate income homeowners for home repairs. And the bigger challenge, which I think in that arena will be finding ways to help low income homeowners with the energy and resiliency retrofits that are both important for helping homeowners stay in their homes in the face of natural disasters that are increasingly common, can help to drive down those energy costs that are contributing to cost burdens, and are also again at the neighborhood or city level an important part of the city's climate change and disaster preparedness strategy. The other sort of bucket of policies in the in this preservation space is really aimed at foreclosure prevention. In foreclosure, we know, again, in the Great Recession, and although since then foreclosure rates have declined, we know that those losses of wealth, losses of homes, and and the kind of stability and security that those provide were concentrated among communities of color, and those foreclosures and some of those losses had started to level off since the Great Recession, but of course now we've encountered a whole new set of challenges in the pandemic, and we're at a point in the pandemic recovery where foreclosure prevention is going to be, I think, absolutely critical to an equitable recovery. And the legislative foreclosure protections expired earlier this year in January 2022. So it's too early to observe, some of those effects, but we know it's a critical window for the city to, partner with and provide support for assistance through reputable nonprofits who can, conduct outreach, identify at-risk homeowners, and connect them with prevention resources. And I'll wrap up. Last piece, what I would end with is just the need to be thinking not just preserving, but about expanding access to homeownership. A key policy lever there is down payment assistance. Down payments are a barrier to homeownership for lower wealth households and disproportionately households of color everywhere, but especially in New York City. This is another place where the city, the primary mode through which the city provides assistance is through forgivable loans. So through the Home First program, for example, home buyers can receive up to $40,000 in down payment assistance, which is about 1/3 of the median down payment required in New York City. And a couple of, just to sort of leave us off the rest of the panel. Along with that, we need to be thinking about how to make home financing sustainable over the long term as well. Once those prospective home buyers are able to access homeownership, and to be effective, to be sustainable and effective, all of these measures require more effective fair housing enforcement, combating discriminatory real estate practices like residential steering, like racial discrimination by co-op boards, and those will help again to ensure access to homeownership in the first place, and to ensure that those benefits accrue equitably across communities. So thank you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists.
Thanks, Sophie. So I think we will then go to our next speaker, who will be Sarah Gerecke. Sarah is a principal at SSG Community Solutions and an adjunct professor of urban planning at Wagner. And I'm going to presume, based off of her contribution to NYC 2025, that she will be discussing how we balance policies between owners and renters, amongst other important housing policy concerns.
Oh, that was a good guess, Thad. Thank you. The motivation, and thanks to Sophie, a lot of what I'm going to say is really building on her work on homeownership. Motivation for my paper was just frankly being distraught and sad about housing advocates fighting each other between advocates for rental dollars and advocates for ownership dollars. And I wanted to explore what would right-sizing homeownership policy look like if it was balanced, and is it balanced properly between owners and renters. So first I wanted to do some baseline information. Sophie went through a lot of the data, but of course New York City is a city of renters. However, there are 1 million homeownership units, making up the 32% homeownership rate, which is half the national average. Ownership rarely looks like a single family detached house with a white picket fence in New York City. Townhouses, 2 to 4 family homes, cooperatives and condominiums and multifamily buildings are much more common than the single family home. But the ownership stock is old. And it's actually shockingly old. Fully 84% of all ownership units were built more than 50 years ago. Finally, as Sophie mentioned, homeowners have affordability challenges. Renters have more affordability challenges in New York City. The racial equity implications Sophie touched on briefly for homeownership are problematic, and I want to dive a little deeper into that. The homeownership gap, as she said, is large and persistent over time. The reason for its persistence really includes a racist history of racist policies. R1 and R2 zoning, which only permit single family homes, cover 15% of the city's land area. And that ranges by borough. In Queens, it's 25%. In Staten Island, it's 22%. There have been a lot of reports of discrimination, as Sophie mentioned, not just by real estate agents, but also in appraisal bias. Downzoning during the Bloomberg administration especially has created shrink-wrapped neighborhoods, as one of my students called it, to keep the neighborhood the same as the day I moved in, especially if it's a low density zone. And redlining still has an impact today, as anyone who's looked at a 1934 redlining map and compares it to single family zones in New York City can see. There's a very strong correlation. Government support is imbalanced between home ownership and rental housing. Tax policies at the federal level favor home ownership, and tax policies at the city level in the form of property tax policy favor home ownership and small homes over rental housing. Condos and co-ops fall in the middle there. Government spending on housing capital and operating projects seem to be heavily weighted toward rental housing. Local New York City non-financial support is much stronger for renters. So tenant resources, a landlord ambassador program, low-cost loans for repairs for multifamily buildings, et cetera, are much more prevalent than programs for first-time home buyers or support for helping homeowners through the home repair process. And just to give an example of that, the program Sophie mentioned, Home Fix and Open Doors, another one that are seeking to help homeowners under the previous administration policy, had a target of 2,100 units over a time span. And that's, again, compared to the 1 million units of ownership housing in the city, it's really quite insignificant, even in terms of the city's own plans. So I have two kind of recommendations in principle and then recommendations for policy. Principle, I wanted to find a rule of thumb. What would make sense? And I'm going to pull out of the air the simplistic rule of thumb that if the New York housing stock is 2/3 rental and 1/3 ownership, perhaps we should see whether the resources supporting renters are 2/3 for rentals and 1/3 for homeowners. In both cases, we want to weight the scale to help low income, seniors, people with special needs, et cetera. But I think that 2/3, 1/3 is helpful. The other thing I might say would weigh the scale towards homeownership is that the history of racial exclusion from homeownership may ask us to rate the scale a little more heavily in favor of encouraging homeownership for people of color who've traditionally been excluded from that as an option. So the recommendations I have aren't all political winners, but perhaps as a package, they may be something that housing professionals can get behind in advocating for housing, not ownership housing, not rental housing, but both. First of all, I'd like to see more supportive services for existing owners and for first-time home buyers. Down payment assistance program that Sophie mentioned is a little cheap compared to other cities, and does not cover 2 to 4 family homes in the same way it covers condos, co-ops, and single family homes, even though the 2 to 4 family homes can be an affordable option for home buyers. Housing counseling is not supported by the city of New York, and anyone who knows me knows I think that's a scandal. And home repairs could be subsidized a great deal more to expand the scale to reach more of the 1 million units. Production of ownership housing also seems to be disadvantaged in the last few administrations. And so it may help to have a little more production on the ownership side. But then we get to other policies that are more difficult, but more equally important in balancing the scale. Tax policy is the first. I don't need to tell this audience that the tax code, especially at the city level, needs to be changed so that all ownership housing is the same, is treated the same, and has greater parity with rental. And finally, I think we should look at zoning changes and incentives for inclusion. We need to appeal to and have flexible zoning choices throughout the city. And that may mean changing the zoning of single family zones to allow for slightly higher density. Today, children, grandchildren, and grandparents should be able to live in the neighborhoods where they grew up and near good jobs and good schools. So with that, I'll give it back to Thad.
Thank you. So we're going to move now to Jerry Salama, who is also an adjunct professor at the Wagner School, but also at the law school. And he will correct me because I will get his extensive background probably incorrect, but he's a former deputy commissioner at the City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, and also a former acting general manager at the New York City Housing Authority. And I believe Jerry will be discussing policies or issues with a focus on smaller owners of multi-unit housing.
Thank you, Thad, and you got it all right.
Amazing. Thanks, Jerry.
Amazing. And I'm going to piggyback on the arc you've just drawn between Sophie on single-family homeownership to Sarah's hybrid between the two, and I'm going to focus on multifamily rental housing, given its importance in New York City. So just as background, we have 3.2 million housing units in New York City. 2.1 million of them are rental units. 73% of renters live in buildings that have 5 or more units. So these mid to larger buildings are critical in housing needs. Of all the rental units, almost 1 million are rent regulated, and another 300,000 have other regulations like Salama public housing. So how these regulations impact the stock is also very important to their health. So when we've ignored the health of this stock, we've lived through disastrous consequences, whether it was the 70s and 80s in disinvestment and abandonment, whether it was 2008 to 2010 for the financial crisis, and now we're dealing with the impact of COVID and the financial impacts they've had. So as certainly as Sarah's mentioned, there's been a lot of political debates among housing advocates about this. My paper, I really focused on some just key financial vulnerabilities of the income and expense within the multifamily rental housing stock. So regardless of whether the owner of this housing is a tenant-controlled entity, a not-for-profit, or a for-profit, the numbers have to work. People have to be able to make a profit to be able to keep the building stable. So we looked at the government's tools, the carrots of incentives, the sticks of enforcement, and try to figure out what would incentivize buildings to stay stable. And then the last aspect of multifamily rental housing that I looked at was a focus on racial equity. And while there's no data on the race, ethnicity, or gender of multifamily owners, the asset is traditionally a source of wealth building. And given the history of redlining and discrimination we looked at initiatives that would address this goal as well. So first, back to the financial analysis. We created a simple pro forma using data from the Rent Guidelines Board. And we focused on areas that have suffered disinvestment in the past, namely Upper Manhattan, the Bronx, and areas of Brooklyn. And so we looked at the average income on one side and average expenses on the other, knowing full well that when you look at the average, you miss those vulnerable buildings that are below average, the ones in troubled neighborhoods where they are more vulnerable. But we used that to create a financial baseline pre-pandemic in order to be able to assess the impacts of COVID on this housing stock. Pre-pandemic, if you look at the income coming into this rent-regulated stock, there are 2 big impacts on it. The first was the 2019 Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act at the state level. That act removed vacancy decontrol, vacancy allowances on re-rentals, ability to remove preference rent during a tenant's tenure, and severely reduced income from major capital improvements. So that shrunk the income that is available. At the city level, the Rent Guidelines Board sets permissible annual rent increases for rents. In the last 7 years, it's been 0. In the last 7 years, 4 of the 7 years, it's been 0. Then I looked on the other side, on the operating expenses. How have costs kept up with the income changes? Three major areas jumped out as significant impact in recent years. The first one is just new regulations that are imposed on multifamily rental housing owners. So every single one of these regulations has a valid health or safety reason, but basically they're all unfunded mandates that building owners must abide by. We documented 11 different regulations imposing new requirements in the last 5 years alone. The second is the issue that Sarah talked about, is real estate taxes. This has been a perennial issue. Ingrid's been on panels for this. There have been more blue ribbons on how we restructure this system. And the impact has been a penalty on multifamily owners. The share of the tax burden paid by multifamily rental properties increased from 24% of value in 1989 to 37% of value in 2017. And to fix this, you would have to impose it on other classes of housing, and there seems to be no political will to do that. And the third big piece that jumped out as a significant issue is the cost and availability of insurance. It's a nerdy issue no one wants to think about, but the costs and availability in low-income neighborhoods is becoming a crisis for multifamily owners. So that was just the baseline. Then we looked at how the pandemic hit. Obviously, we know what happened. Tenants lost jobs, incomes went down, they couldn't pay rents. NYU did an analysis in March, and a conservative estimate was that income went down by 7%, not counting commercial income. So if there were retail stores in the building that subsidized the apartments, that wasn't counted, and the retail crisis has been even greater in New York City, regardless of the pandemic. So while building owners might have temporarily reduced their expenses by not delivering services, eventually you've got to pay mortgages and tax and insurance, and that financial issue is real. And then finally, we looked at the racial equity as it relates to ownership. Discrimination is alive and well. It's not a past old ancient history. We saw this when it came to the distribution of the PPP, the Payroll Protection Program. Small minority women-owned businesses had a major disadvantage at accessing these funds because it required strong banking relationships. This is the same disadvantage that MWBEs have in accessing loan and equity to be able to own and finance multifamily rental housing. So I'm just going to summarize quickly my recommendations, and happily we'll talk with all the overlap with my panelists on this. So first was one just relating to general housing policy. And this may sound obvious, but my first policy recommendation is that our elected officials need to welcome all good owners of housing and punish all bad owners of housing, regardless of the tenure of ownership. They may sound simple, but it's not been the political climate in New York in the last few years. There needs to be a generic early warning system of owners that are in trouble. And there needs to be assistance to reach out to tenants, landlords, and the communities they affect. And it should be based on an objective financial analysis, not a political agenda, as to which programs are available to which types of owners. Second is regulatory reform. I think even housing advocates believe that the 2019 act that the state went too far in terms of cutting income. We need to step back and have that objective conversation that Sarah was referring to with all advocates about looking at where income was cut too sharply, where expenses are too great, whether it's in taxes or insurance, and have more impact on those areas. Third is pandemic relief. As we all know, the state and the feds rolled out rent relief programs in New York. We had many administrative missteps, but then the programs did start rolling out funds, and now we're out of money. Simply stated, we need more funding, or you're going to have an avalanche of housing issues that can affect both tenants and owners. The eviction moratorium, as Sophie mentioned, as it relates to foreclosure, was lifted at the end of January. Those cases are now going through housing court. At some point, we have to pay the piper, and we're going to have to look on how to restructure either rents or incomes in those buildings. And finally, the recommendation on MWBEs. So the city has had some small programs to increase minority and women-owned business participation when it comes to city-owned property. True MWB assistance programs, though, need to extend beyond just city property, look at existing and potential owners, and look at private initiatives. So in the wake of George Floyd, all kinds of institutions are running around, have created now new initiatives, and the city should look on how to piggyback onto those vehicles and figure out how to actually reach them using subsidies as well as the private money going in here. So I'm going to turn it back to Thad and look forward to conversations and questions.
Thanks, Jerry. Last but not least, Ingrid Gould Ellen, who is the NYU Wagner Paulette Goddard Professor of Urban Policy and Planning and the Faculty Director at the NYU Furman Center, is going to speak. She actually has an overview paper of housing policy issues that I would highly recommend that people who are interested in go to the NYC 2025 website and read on their own. She's actually going to talk about opportunities for commercial conversions, which is something that has become, or the need for such conversations on this policy have become more apparent since this project has begun. So Ingrid, I will turn it to you to discuss this important topic now.
Great, thank you. And really happy to be on this panel and excited to dig into a conversation with Jerry and Sarah and Sophie. So I'll be quick, but I thought I would focus, as Thad said, on one specific proposal that I mentioned briefly in this sort of overview framing paper, which is commercial conversions. And I think conversions may really be a critical opportunity in the coming years. I mean, if there's one thing that seems certain about the 21st century, it's its unpredictability, right? From, September 11th to Superstorm Sandy to the pandemic, the first 2 decades of the 21st century have already been a roller coaster for cities across the country, and particularly for New York. And more than ever, I think policymakers need tools to make the building stock more flexible and adaptable to, or at least to remove the obstacles that hinder such adaptation. And I think part of this short term, right, the growing frequency of storms and pandemics suggests a need for sort of buffer spaces to house people during emergencies. But there may also, though, be need for more flexibility to allow for more permanent conversions. Given the particular market conditions, right? I mean, in the office sector, right? Many office workers have grown accustomed to working from home. I'm sitting in my home office right now, right? And I think that firms may, look to reduce their office footprint to shed costs, and it seems unlikely. Also, I think the business travel will fully recover to previous levels, as many firms have sort of learned that that these sort of Zoom meetings are maybe not ideal, but that they're viable substitutes and a lot cheaper for in-person than in-person gatherings. So I think the demand for sort of hotel spaces and large meeting spaces is likely not to to remain lower than it was. It'll certainly come up from where it is now. And so I think in the light of these market dynamics, the conversion of commercial space into apartments seems likely to be sort of a critical tool to both to reduce the excess supply of commercial space in that sort of soft market, while also helping to increase the stock of housing to meet residential demand and to improve housing affordability in the city. And compared with demolition and new construction, conversions take less time. They generally cost less money. Jerry, I'm sure we'll discuss that, challenge that, but they produce a lower environmental impact, and they're likely to provoke less NIMBY opposition, right? Because there are already structures that are in place. So I think it's worth sort of asking whether the office buildings of Midtown Manhattan really have the potential to kind of create the next generation of lofts, and whether hotel spaces could really be sort of converted at scale to supportive housing and other smaller units. And at the end of just to sort of benchmark the opportunity, at the end of 2021, the city had 3.5 billion square feet of residential space, 670 million square feet of office space, and about 80 million square feet of hotel space. And if you assumed that about 10% of the office and the hotel space were converted, that would produce another, this is very back of the envelope, but say another 75,000 homes, right? That's not, that would amount to like a 2% increase in the housing stock in New York. So that's not, enormous, but it's also not nothing. And unfortunately, and it's a sort of, piggybacking on both Jerry and Sarah's presentations, that New York City's land use laws have generally become more and not less prescriptive over time, and are generally not very friendly to such conversions. And I think some of the changes that I would recommend to permit such conversions are to reduce the distinctions between shorter term and longer term residences. Right now, we have a different set of rules for short term residences and long term. And short term residents, including homeless shelters where children and families can remain for 2 years, 3 years. But they're not allowed to longer term. Short term residents can be in light manufacturing zones. Long term residences can't. Short term residences like hotels require a 20-foot yard. Long-term residents require a 30-foot yard, right? So that's number one. So number two is reconsider that just generally the separation of uses that's embedded in our zoning code, as I think people seem to increasingly prefer to live in, or many people prefer to live in vibrant mixed-use districts. Third is to consider more pathways to compliance for older commercial buildings that are not up to contemporary codes. And because these sort of regulatory transition costs can be a real barrier in making those conversions happen, and to allowing, again, for flexibility in the housing stock. And I think also consider, some exemptions to ease normal permitting and environmental review processes when these buildings already exist and they're already occupied in some fashion, right? A good example, a counterexample to the way New York City has handled this so far is California, which has this, program, Project Homekey, where they significantly relaxed these approval processes, and they've seen much greater take up on hotel conversions. And to be clear, right, I'm not saying that the city should completely remove all regulations on conversions, but I think the city should increase regulatory flexibility where appropriate to enable the built environment to adapt as demand shifts in what I think are going to be both predictable but also unpredictable ways, right, in the coming decades. And I won't talk about it now, but I think also, would love to talk with the group about sort of the need for kind of a potential subsidy to incentivize the inclusion of affordable housing in these conversions. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So we do have about 20 minutes of time for discussion and conversation. We certainly, if any of the panelists have questions for other panelists, we can certainly start with that. We can also have some attendees if you want to use the Q&A function on Zoom. I'll take a look at that. Ingrid, did you have a question or a comment?
I do. I have multiple questions. I'll try not to, I don't want to monopolize too much, but let me ask us a question for Jerry and then a question for Sarah and Sophie, right? The question for Jerry is just about, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the cost and availability of insurance and sort of what's driving that issue and what the magnitude is. Because that one seems sort of easier to solve, but anyway, and then for Sarah and Sophie, this is, I think, a harder question, but I guess it's, I'm wondering sort of about this balance. I just sort of want to play devil's advocate, right? We've got, on the one hand, we know homeowners are, generally higher income. We know that, they are receiving lots of generous incentives from the federal government. So tax subsidies in favored tax treatment, let's say, in New York City. So like, should we really be spending our marginal subsidy dollars on supporting homeowners rather than low-income renters? So I know that's provocative and annoying, but I just feel like give you a chance to answer that.
I'm going to jump in on insurance.
Sure.
Okay, so that was the one where with our research assistants, we couldn't actually find data. It's not available. And so I did it by anecdote on this one in terms of talking with insurance agents. And as you know, I am an owner and manager of affordable housing in Harlem. And I've been in conversations with the insurance companies where the brokers get frustrated and say, let me just put the owner on the phone. And they will tell you point blank, they do not insure affordable housing because they think it's too high a risk. And so we've lost more and more companies, and on a typical annual renewal, I'll have one option, I can take it or leave it. And so this is, and we reach out with agents trying to find other companies, and it's more and more limited. I've talked to other owners of multifamily housing, and they tell me the same experience. And it's typically the same company you've had where you've had no losses, and they will just renew because they know they can do okay. A new company won't come. So I'm certain this is the same problem for not-for-profit, for-profits, and tenant co-ops that are in low-income neighborhoods that are experiencing this issue, whether we could get the state insurance and banking superintendent to get involved, whether there is other ways to create our own co-ops. I am doing a deal with JP Morgan Asset Management. They have the most extraordinary insurance programs because they are such a big owner across the country. Why couldn't all the multifamily housing owners get together in a way that's facilitated by government to create something like this? But there are ways that we have to break through this, but everyone kind of ignores it because it's a boring issue.
Yeah, and the Housing Partnership Network does have an umbrella insurance purchase program for nonprofits in the country, but I'm just surprised because it just seems like I would think if anything, affordable housing is lower risk.
It is. I haven't had losses, but it doesn't matter.
It's a perception. Yeah. That's disturbing.
Yeah.
Jerry hit on a very important policy area that we never teach enough about, which is if it's boring sounding, it actually becomes unprioritized. So it's a great point, Jerry. I'm sorry, and then it was Sarah. You're going to start with the next part.
Sure. I'll take a stab at Ingrid's impossible question about why should we bother helping homeowners because they're so privileged already. If I can misparaphrase.
Well, again, it's the trade-off with homeowners versus low-income renters.
Homeowners versus renters. A couple of thoughts. First of all, I'm not in favor of helping all homeowners across the board or all renters across the board. I do think that aid and government action needs to be targeted to low income, seniors, people of color, people who are disadvantaged in the market or for whom the market fails. I would note that homeowners aren't alone in being treated special. And so renters, for example, if you're rent regulated, there's no means test for receiving rent regulation benefits. It may not be on the scale of the homeownership benefits, but it's this desire I have to just take a look at all of this and see where the balance lies. There are benefits to homeownership that make it worthwhile, and I'm going to let Sophie talk about those because I think she's touched upon them more. But the one final thing I would say here is that I don't think we need to choose homeowner versus rental, but we do need to ask whether people have a choice. Are people able to pursue their choice if they want to become homeowners? And there's a lot of reasons they may want to do that, but the barriers to homeownership are very much because the market is stuck. And especially at the low ends of the market, there's very little support for first-time home buyers. So that would be my take on that very good question. Sophie?
Thanks, Sarah. No, I think that's really on the nose. My other thoughts, Ingrid, I think it's a very hard question as well. My my personal curiosity tends to come down on the side of, what can we be doing to expand some of the benefits of home ownership to rent, or, what can we do to try to create wealth building opportunities, credit building opportunities, things like that outside of home ownership. But to put on, to make the case, right? One reaction to the question is, which, maybe this is cheating a little bit, but I think one reason to try to move forward with some of these home ownership focused proposals is that if we don't focus on foreclosure prevention, there will be foreclosures. If we don't focus on expanding access to home ownership, there will be, there will still be lots of homeowners, but the community, the people who will be most affected by the foreclosures that happen, the people who won't get access to new home ownership opportunities are going to be disproportionately communities of color. So I think it's the, holding the constants that we need to hold constant in the short to medium term, like assuming the world as it is for the next, short-term policy landscape, I think there is a little bit of an equity mandate to try to make sure that we don't just stay in a place where homeownership is the primary wealth building mechanism for most households. And, we haven't intervened. So that's going to be mostly for white households. So yes, and the short answer, I guess, would be to say racial equity is the reason. But I'm ambivalent as well. But and then as Sarah alluded to, there are benefits to homeownership, some of which are created by the policy choices we've made, so relying on them is a little bit artificial because we could, we could change some of the policy mechanisms to make homeownership a different economic proposition, et cetera. But there are, to a certain extent also, people, this is like how, this is a housing policy, but people want to be homeowners, maybe not as many as we've incentivized to become homeowners through the schemes that we've created. But if people, it's right now, I think the other, beyond it being a tax preferred way to have your housing, if you can have it, it is the, probably the easiest way to ensure that you can stay in the neighborhood where, in the neighborhood or on the block, whatever, where you want to live. So yeah, racial equity, 1, stability, long-term tenure, 2.
Great, thank you. So there's a question from an attendee, and I'm not sure who this would be best for. So I'll just read the question and then you can figure out who's the best one to answer it. Probably any of you can answer it, quite frankly. So what do the panelists think of converting rental units to ownership in public housing?
Ingrid, you want that one?
Jerry's the first to unmute, so I think he gets it.
I can. Let me jump in on a couple of things. So New York City Housing Department, Housing Preservation Development, HPD, has had a very successful program since the 70s called TIL, Tenant Interim Lease. And it applied to what was a city-owned stock of housing, the in-rem housing, where tenants could get an option to buy and own their buildings as low-income cooperatives. Incredibly successful program, probably created 25,000 units of co-ops, especially in low-income neighborhoods in multifamily rental housing. So there is a model, there's a way in which this can happen. The issue is it costs money because you have to renovate the buildings, and especially public housing, as you know, across the entire stock has a capital need in the $30 to $35 billion range. So if you apply that to any individual development in NYCHA, you have to figure some funding to be able to make the buildings in good physical condition before you sell them or give them to tenants. Secondly, tenants have to be trained to manage and own their own buildings. And so through HPD, there were a lot of training programs run by not-for-profits, and you could do that, absolutely could do it. It means that you take out of the stock turnover of affordable units for other families to come in if it's now owned by a household. And then you have to figure out how you want to structure that ownership. Do you want those tenants to be able to make a profit and make money, increase their wealth as we do? As Sophie said, that's the reason for home ownership. Or do you want to constrain them that they must only resell them at low cost to another owner, and then they don't make the asset increase in wealth? And so it defeats part of the reason why there's home ownership. The value would be control. If you believe tenants can control it better and manage it better because they have an incentive since they live there, but they wouldn't make the wealth side of why we have home ownership in the US.
If I could just tag on to that, I think that housing authority units do not turn over rapidly now. So it's not, in other words, once a tenant lives in housing authority, that unit is effectively off the market, I think an average of 15 or 18 years, which may be about the same as an ownership unit. I think the key question is whether it's right for the housing authority to have all the attributes of free market home ownership and wealth building. And I'd say absolutely not. The housing authority should retain the principles that and the place in the housing firmament where it is serving the lowest income and neediest, and is housing of the last resort for I shouldn't say it that way, but it's housing the lowest income New Yorkers. And it could be in an ownership model. It may not have the wealth appreciation benefits, but it would have the stability benefits of home ownership, and it would have greater control and collective ownership. So I think it's worth considering, but I totally agree with Jerry. It should be on a till model, or even more restrictive than till, but something that would guarantee permanent affordability despite an ownership structure.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you. And we'll just underscore the $40 billion capital needs. I mean, you're not going to be doing any families any favor right now if you gave them ownership of really seriously dilapidated buildings.
Thank you. So since there doesn't seem to be any other any questions from the audience, I guess this is where I get to use my prerogative as the moderator to throw in my question. So it seems like from someone who's not a housing expert, but listening to you, that there are great ideas for how to address some of the issues in New York City's perennial housing quagmire of how do you make it affordable, how do we develop more. How much of this is just strictly a budget issue, that there's just not money, and how much of it is just that there's money, but it is not necessarily being spent where it is most impactful? I mean, when I see as Ingrid and the rest of you have mentioned that, the NYCHA capital deficit of, $40 to $50 billion, that seems like an almost insurmountable goal, although there have been plans on how to address it. So how much of this is just there's not enough money for these programs versus there's not enough political will to change the programs that don't work and funnel the money to where they would be more impactful? Or is this too much of a question to ask with 2 minutes left?
Ingrid, you want to go?
No, I want to hear what you and the rest of you say.
Well, obviously, asking the question is both that, right? New York has had the most capital funding for housing of any municipality in the country for years, since Mayor Koch. So we have committed extraordinary capital resources to housing that most other places don't. So is there money? Could we always do more? Of course. Have costs gone skyrocketing since the late 80s when Koch started his program? Yes. What used to be a $25,000 per unit subsidy is now a $250,000 a unit subsidy. So just run the math as to how many units you could create. And even, Ingrid's converting commercial, you need some money. And so you figure out what that costs, it's money. And then some of the topics that Sarah and I were raising on real estate taxes, those are political will. That is simply a function of how you impose a burden on different political classes. And so I'm encouraged by new mayor and new governor who, by virtue of their not being dragged through years of stasis, maybe they could come together and figure out something.
They're talking about it.
Yeah, maybe you figure it out over 10 years or 20 years and say, no, we're not going to impact homeowners the first year. But clearly we know paying $1,000 a year in real estate taxes for a single family house in New York City makes no sense, right?
Yeah, there may be ways to sort of stage it politically so that you delay. I mean, the only thing it sort of is a wrap up, I would actually just sort of circle back a little bit to actually my framing paper, which my whole argument was that the city, the city, again, as Jerry has said, I mean, it's done so much more. It has invested so much more in its housing stock and in affordable housing than any other city. But the focus and the last mayor since Mayor Koch really deserve, a huge amount of credit for these, setting up these ambitious goals and for the most part, attaining them. But they've really been sort of single-mindedly focused on traditional kind of affordable housing production. And I think that what this collection of papers, a lot of what, if you listen to the proposals, a lot of what Sophie and Sarah and Jerry and I are sort of recommending, some of this doesn't have like big price tags associated with it. So some of it is about, so I think thinking hard about moving beyond that single-minded focus. Again, not that we shouldn't be focused on building new affordable housing, but that we should be thinking more broadly about making the housing market work better for everybody in an equitable and racially, inclusive way.
Great. Okay. Well, that brings us to the close of the hour. So I want to thank the panelists and thank you to our attendees who tuned in and hopefully learned a little something. I always learn something from listening to all of you because this is not my area of expertise. So thank you for enlightening myself and the attendees. So we have more panels coming up this week. On Wednesday, we actually have 2. So hopefully you will see information on that coming shortly. So thank you very much, and hope to see you all later this week at more panels. Thanks.
Thanks, Pat.
Bye-bye.
Bye.